right, Who Dat Nation, welcome inside Black and Gold. Steve Geller along with Jeff Nowak, and we are post-Super Bowl, also post-Mardi Gras. Hope everybody survived.
Oh, man, yeah, it's the day after Fat Tuesday, which is also called Ash Wednesday, I suppose. I was talking to somebody about, this was a really early Mardi Gras compared to next year when it's in March, and they were telling me how they prefer it later, and I don't prefer it later. I prefer it the way it was, because I kind of wait. So you have like Thanksgiving, then Christmas, then New Year. And then you kind of have this month in between where it's like, do I be healthy in January or do I just wait it out until after Mardi Gras? Because I can only keep my body without poison in it for so long. So like when it's done in February, I get to now and I'm like, okay, all right, okay. I can figure my life out for a second. Whereas like if it's in March, it's like half the year with me being this way. So anyway, I prefer it. But how was your Mardi Gras, Steve? Did you get into it?
Yeah, definitely had a good time. Happy it's all over though, just because of the crowds and traffic nonsense makes everything a little bit easier. But obviously while it's going on, you have a blast. The kiddo, my 13-year-old had a great time with his friends. They're busy just doing all their own thing kind of deal. But yeah, overall, and thankfully the weather gods cooperated with everything. We had a fantastic time.
Yeah, the only real storms happened overnight, so we were able to avoid. There was one Saturday that I think the parades got washed out, but otherwise we were good. That's what I think people don't live around here might not realize is it's like by the time you get to Fat Tuesday, it's like everyone's exhausted. Like it's a marathon just to get to that point. Like that's not necessarily the party day. That's the I made it day. And obviously there's parties too. But we're gonna get into we're not gonna sit here and talk about Mardi Gras the whole time, right? Where this is a Saints podcast, we're gonna talk about the Saints. We're gonna dive a good bit into Klint Kubiak, right? In the second and third segment, they have it's official. "Quote unquote official." The Saints have not announced it at the time that we are recording this, and it's super obnoxious. Anytime this happens, because I guarantee you, by the time someone listens to this podcast, it will have been announced, or at least Klint will have been announced. The question I have is, okay, how many other coaches are getting announced? Right. We'll talk about that toward the end. I want to push that toward the end of this podcast, just in case maybe we'll luck out.
Breaking news on the pod.
Yeah, and those announcements will come right while we're recording this. But we're recording this around noon on Wednesday. So if you're listening and you're like, well, why aren't they talking about this? If it happened after noon on Wednesday, yeah, it's tough. But that's the life we lead in recording things. So we're going to talk about that. I want to talk about his time with the Vikings. I have some clips of interviews with Klint from back then. There's not a ton to talk about from his time with the Broncos in terms of interviews I can go back and watch, right? And also the 49ers.
Yeah, you mentioned that was something during Super Bowl week. I'm like, oh, it's media night. We'll hear from Klint Kubiak. It's like, no, you idiot. They don't bring the passing game coordinator to the podium.
Right. Well, it's like Bob Bicknell worked for the Saints for 2 years. Did he talk once? Like maybe, but not publicly and not anywhere that you could find the recording of it. So anyway, there isn't a ton to kind of dive into in terms of, him talking about the 49ers offense, but there is a ton from the Vikings. And I think we may have overlooked that a bit in terms of the importance that his Vikings tenure will have. Sure. While we kind of get excited about the Shanahan of it all. But first things first, I do want to talk about Mardi Gras a little bit more, mostly in the sense of, I think when you play for a team in New Orleans, it's important to embrace the culture of New Orleans. And not everyone does that the same way. Yeah. Not everyone goes out to parades or goes on floats or whatever. But more often than not, particularly new people to New Orleans, you'll see them, embrace the parades. And, I'll share my screen here for a bit and kind of go into we did see some Saints players out at parades, right? Like we have, a lot of the Saints players here riding in tux, right? Nephi Sewell's out there. He probably just had ACL surgery. He's limping around. You got Peyton Turner's on that float. Peyton Turner's done more at Mardi Gras than he has done for the Saints.
Oh,
last couple years. Colin Saunders, Malcolm Roach, Eric McCoy, DeMarco Jackson. You got guys out there. You got guys having a good time. But one of my favorite images of Mardi Gras this year was actually Rashid Shaheed, because he took a nice long ride in one of these cozy reclining chairs that I don't know. What do they make?
One of those.
I've always assumed they take a electric wheelchair and just take the chair off it and put a lazy boy recliner on it.
For sure, right.
But those things move. Like those things go quick. I don't know if you've ever watched that part of the parade. Those things are zipping by, and I'm sure he had a great old time on one of those. The Saints tweeted out a picture of it, videos of it. There's a lot, and the Saints are more than ready. They're always ready to document this and send it out. I don't have a picture of it, but Jameis Winston was also at parades taking pictures. I know he danced around with Margaret Orr for a little bit. It's just the image of a player, of a person embracing the city that they play football in. They're not from here, right? None of these guys are from New Orleans. Malcolm Roach is the closest in terms of being from Baton Rouge. But, these are just players who are embracing the atmosphere of New Orleans. And that just brings me to one thing that I'm probably being overly critical of this, right?
No, I hear you. Where's QB1?
Where the hell is Derek Carr, right? And so I'll tell you where Derek Carr was. He was speaking at a mega church in Las Vegas on Super Sunday. There's only one Super Sunday at the Super Bowl. It's in New Orleans, where this man plays quarterback, but instead he was, as Bacchus was rolling in New Orleans, he's talking at a church in Las Vegas. And I don't know how long ago this was planned. Maybe it's something that he agreed to last year before he signed on with the Saints and he's just there. I don't know. But I do know that Mardi Gras goes for a month.
You're right.
Right. And Derek Carr has parade age children. I wasn't here in 2006. I don't know what Drew Brees did over the first couple Mardi Gras in the city. I know his kids were a lot, they were younger. We're talking about Balin. You remember the picture of him holding up Balin at the Super Bowl? I mean, how old was he? 3, 4? Like he was a toddler.
Had to be right.
So, in 2006, 3 years earlier, it's not like he had parade age children. Derek Carr has 3 children who are the exact age you'd want to bring out to a parade. What the hell? Like, go on his Instagram, right? Go. He's like, I don't want to say it's like a photo op thing, but at the same time, when you're the quarterback of the New Orleans Saints, it's about more than just playing football in the city. The city needs to feel like you are embracing the city. And one easy layup way to do that is to go hang out at a goddamn parade for an hour, take a picture with your kids and post it on Instagram so that people can see that you are embracing the city and the culture. I don't even care if you're in Metairie. Heck, go to Slidell. Like, go to a goddamn parade during Mardi Gras season. And if you did go to a parade and didn't show that to people, I don't know. I don't think he... and there was the whole thing about the parade float and Derek Carr, the zombie Derek Carr, and he did reply to that, right? And he was a good sport about it, it's just great. I think that's something he had to do. He had to reply to it. Otherwise it would have seemed like, oh, he's just mad about it. I don't know. Like, that bothers me just in the sense of like it was a lot easier for Drew because the expectations were a lot lower in 2006. They immediately went to the NFC Championship. 3 years later, they won a Super Bowl. And I had people saying, well, they never put Drew Brees on one of these satirical floats. And I will tell you, you're wrong. You don't play quarterback for the Saints for 15 years and not end up on a joke float at some point or another, right? Like, it's a little more difficult to make fun of Drew Brees because he's the Super Bowl champion. He's a first ballot Hall of Famer. Whereas Derek Carr in year one struggled, got hurt constantly, and played through it, and had these obvious red zone issues that they were making fun of on the float. So it's much more low-hanging fruit that you can get to. And I think the float builders nailed it. It was a great looking float. But I don't know. One of the I've had people say this to me, and it's one of the criticisms that I think is very valid as it pertains to Derek Carr. And there's football criticisms you can make, and there's football points you can make. But one of the criticisms I've heard that I can't sit there and say, no, you're completely off base, is I don't think Derek Carr understands New Orleans. I don't know if he necessarily has embraced the city in a way that the quarterback of the Saints needs to. You're the closest thing to a politician that you could have on an NFL team. I don't need to see the coordinators or the coaches, but I do need to see the quarterback. I do need to see the guy who you're supposed to go out to these games and cheer for as if he's a part of the city. And right now, it feels like Derek Carr plays quarterback in New Orleans, and that's the end of it, right?
No,
like if
totally
he left, if he left this offseason, what would his impact be in this city beyond the Superdome?
That he ate Chipotle when he first got here, and he doesn't like Mardi Gras.
Oh, I don't even know if he cares for. I don't know if he likes Mardi Gras or not. That's the point. Is I don't even have any indication one way or another that he's aware it exists. And to me, that's an issue. And one of the reasons that everyone loves Jameis is because he's visible, because he's out there partying, because he's having a good time, the same way the city is. And I don't know. I would love to hear his explanation for why he wasn't involved in anything this Mardi Gras season, or at least didn't do so visibly. I just don't think it's a good look. And that's all I'm going to say on it. I don't need to rant all day about it, but I do think that that's a valid criticism.
No, you're right there. The fact that you didn't even see him out at any single parade. We're not saying you got to be riding in the thing, throwing stuff to folks, but to have you and the family out on any parade route, like you were saying, downtown, Metairie, North Shore, just somewhere to see you out and about amongst the locals. I think that is pretty key.
And playing better will be the biggest solve to all of these.
Absolutely.
Right? If he comes out next season and plays great, there will be a lot less criticism thrown at Derek Carr. You won't hear the boos, right? But I do think that it should be something on his radar that he needs to ingratiate himself into this city, into this culture in some way. And this would have been just a very easy way to kind of make inroads in that process. And I don't think he took advantage of it. And it's frustrating to see. And plus, his kids don't want to go to parades. I don't know. It's weird. But
I can't imagine any kid doesn't want to go to a parade here.
Right.
Or any parade in general, honestly.
Who doesn't want to catch garbage from a float? I love it. Kids love it. Anyway. I do want to close out this segment hearing from Cam Jordan. He talked on the Around the NFL podcast. You grabbed that audio for us, and I'm not even going to lead into it. Let's just hear what Cam had to say.
Mickey Loomis said something about after the season. This is what struck me of that, we need to do some changes maybe with the roster and personnel to improve the culture. And that comment was improve the culture, because when they hired Dennis Allen, they were like, we're keeping Dennis Allen because we want to keep this culture going. He's the guy that's been there and been running this defense. So, what do you think Mickey Loomis is talking about there, with the culture?
I've learned to not put my GM hat on.
Okay.
I've played this game, and it's never worked out well. I was this is what we're going to do with the draft. This is how we're doing it. This is what our team needs, and have been completely wrong. So I was we're going to get a defensive end. And then in the first round, we got a corner. And I was and then we got it back into the first round. And I was oh, this is the DN time. And then we went offensive tackle, which turned out to be a phenomenal draft. So you learn to shut the hell up and let the up top do what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to want more. If we're 3 years dry of playoffs, and maybe a culture shock needs to happen. I think there's a core group of our players that push positivity and whatever it is. In fact, I loved our locker room this year. But if our locker room isn't winning at a high rate, things going to have to shake. And one day they're going to be like, hey, Cam, it's your time, bud. And I'm like, hey, I hope the Saints keep on winning. Whatever it takes, I just want the Saints to win.
And I think he makes some good points there, which one, it is funny because in the past you had heard him be a little more kind of forward and I'd love it. It's D tackle time, defensive line time in the draft. And I don't know, maybe he heard some feedback on that from up top. I don't know, but it's true. You look at this locker room and there are a lot of positive forces, positive elements in it. But when you're not winning, that really draws attention to the cracks that form. And it's not. Sometimes it is as simple as winning games, and that helps your everything kind of feel better, right? But at the end of the day, you look back and you're like, well, why didn't we win at the rate we needed to win at? Why didn't we win at the high enough rate? And that's where you make changes. And like Cam says, you probably do need to shake up, and we've seen that in the offensive staff, right? The lead into that question was culture, continuity, whatever. That's changed. That's gone. We're not doing that anymore. We're not doing continuity. We've changed the entire offensive staff in one offseason.
Right. We talked about that for sure.
Right. We changed the entire defensive staff last offseason. The next step is you change the roster, right? And they haven't really done that yet. So I do think it's interesting. And, you know, culture shock, it's a kind of a word without meaning to some extent. Like, it's basically just, hey, we're going to keep pulling levers to see what works. But no, I mean, I think Cam is kind of also aware of his own mortality there. Of like, yeah, one of these days they're gonna be like, hey, bud, you want to go for a long walk?
And to a little bit, they did kind of do that to him this season where he was used less on third down.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think that was driven more by injuries than anything else.
I agree, right.
But at the same time, I think you did find something that worked. And if Cam is being honest about, you know, wanting to do whatever it takes to win, then I think you have to look at that and say, how do we build off this? Even when Cam is healthy, is he a third down pass rusher? And I think in a lot of instances, the answer might be no. And do you bring Zach Bond back and have him in that pass rush, like specialist pass rusher role? Or do you kind of keep banging your head against the wall and saying, okay, if Cam is healthy, he can get after the quarterback like he has always. I think he at this point in Cam's career, he's still a useful player. But he's the type of player that in a lot of other instances, you'd see him land on a higher level contending team, right? You'd see like the Justin Houston ends up going wherever, and he's not a full-time player anymore, but he's still a guy where you're like, oh, Justin Houston's there, right? Like, yeah, that's the player. Just because you got that extension on the Saints doesn't mean that you have to be committed to everything staying the same. And I do think, and I've said this throughout the season, I think he's a great run player. And I think that's where you should start. And I think that should be his focus. And you need to figure out how to rush the passer in creative ways. So, you know, I will be interested to see how that situation develops throughout the offseason.
Yeah, that's one thing in camp. Can't wait to see what Cam comes back like for this season, because I think we heard it from Mickey Loomis when asked about Cam Jordan's performance this year, saying basically he spent the season playing on one leg. And kudos to Cam for, you know, muscling through that injury and being able to perform and be available, because we're so critical of guys that, oh, he's not even available for a game. We know that's not the case with Cam. He plays through so much. But just this year, he just didn't look like the same guy.
It is funny when I hear people complain about how guys like Peyton Turner, Marcus Davenport, Isaiah Vasquez, how they're never available, but then also say like, but Cam's old. And I was like, well, at least he's here. Yeah. But no, Cam, yeah, he was playing. How he explained it when we were talking to him at the end of the season is like he had a high ankle sprain against the Falcons, which was like kind of a shin injury. I think they initially named it a shin injury. And there's some more technical explanation of like the actual ligaments or whatever that he injured. And then the next week he compounded it with a low ankle sprain. Like, so he had a high ankle sprain and a low ankle sprain on the same ankle, and he didn't miss a game. So yeah, you could complain about Cam Jordan in whatever way you want. You will never say that man is soft. I think he also had like a major, like a significant shoulder injury that he was dealing with. Anyway,
hearing him go through all that even makes you more mad at the whole COVID season when he was forced to sit the game out and ruin his streak.
It is funny because I do wonder, you know, in the next season he missed a game with an eye injury.
Yeah,
and I do wonder if, because he wanted to play, like it was a situation.
Absolutely,
like no, that's a bad idea. But I do wonder if he hadn't had that Iron Man streak end in 2021, would he have played through it in 2022 at least to some level? Because like he could at least be suit up and be on the field for a couple snaps just to keep that going. But it's not a thing anymore. But this was the first year he played 17 games. Previously, he had joked with his dad that he's like, oh, I'm just a 16 game player. Because the first two 17-game seasons, he missed one game in each of them. So he had technically played in 16 games in every season of his career. Now it's 17 this past season. So got it.
Kudos to Cam. And yeah, just waiting to see what 2024 season brings for him, because I do think I expect a huge bounce back for him. What his pass rush numbers and sack totals just weren't there this year. And I think that's going to get under his skin like it got under Saints fans.
Agreed. And I'm interested to see if they add any more pass rush depth in the draft. Like I talked about a guy like Adrian Robinson would make a ton of sense. Did I say Adrian? I keep saying Adrian Robinson because he was a tight end from Cincinnati. But it's Darius Robinson. He's the defensive lineman from Missouri. So somebody like that.
All those Robinsons look the same.
Adrian Robinson. I thought he was going to be real good. I think he ended up on the Giants. But anyway, we will continue that. Let's wrap up this segment. This is Inside Black and Gold. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do that. This is the first episode of season 3. We made it.
Woohoo!
We turn over the calendar after the Super Bowl. So because the Super Bowl happened, we didn't talk about it. The Super Bowl did happen. The Chiefs won again. Now we reset. And we talk about how the Chiefs can win again next year. Because if they could win with that roster, I don't know what roster they can't win with. Marquez Valdes-Scantling.
Day one of training camp. Is Taylor Swift there with the Chiefs?
Does the Travis Kelce Taylor Swift relationship make it through the offseason? Heck, does Travis Kelce retire? I saw some rumblings that he might retire because Jason retired, and they got this whole media thing like the Mannings.
Yeah,
because they already have a podcast. So that would be interesting if Travis decides to retire. Because like Gronk did the same thing. Gronk was in a situation where he's like, I won a ton of Super Bowls. How much do I need to prove here? And he retired, but then came back and won another Super Bowl.
I think Travis definitely is thinking about that three-peat, though. So I haven't heard any rumblings about him really serious about stepping away, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, who knows?
Right.
But yeah, it's
to
when you won as frequently as he has with Pat. It's like, how much more do I have? What else do I have to prove? At a certain point, it's like all I can do is get worse than I am right now.
Like I said,
whereas a guy like Cam,
now it's chasing the first ever three-peat.
Has no one ever three-peated?
No one's ever three-peated magically.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I thought the Cowboys did, but maybe I'm wrong. Like, I think the Cowboys maybe got to 3. I don't know.
Maybe,
but yeah, I guess that is something that. But like at a certain point, it's like, yeah, no one's ever four-peated either. Like we're having that same conversation. Anyway, but let's wrap up this segment. This is Inside Black and Gold. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do that. I'm Jeff Nowak. He is Steve Geller. You can follow me on Twitter at Jeff_Nowak. A lot of you have. I'm still waiting for the rest. You can follow him at Steve Geller WWL, and make sure to subscribe to the show on YouTube at WWL Sports. We're going to come back, talk a whole lot of Klint. That's Kubiak, if you were unaware. Let's do it. And we're back on Inside Black and Gold. I am Jeff Nowak. He is Steve Geller. We are going to be talking about the Saints' new offensive coordinator, Klint Kubiak. And the deal is done, at the very least. We know that. That was reported shortly after the Super Bowl. We only got like hours past the Super Bowl before this deal was done, in case you were wondering how antsy the Saints were to get it done. I did wonder if maybe they'd wait out Fat Tuesday, but they did not. They still have not announced it yet as of the time we're recording this. So there's a chance that they announce it this afternoon. We're recording this on Wednesday around noon. So if that happens, great. It's not going to change much either way. But the Saints are bringing in a Kubiak. And one of the interesting things to me about Klint is, you look at a coach and you're like, oh, we're so excited to bring this guy in. It's a guy who he's going to be on his 4th team in 4 seasons. And you look at that and you're like, wow, what's he doing to piss these teams off? Like leaving. And it is interesting because you're on the Vikings in 2021. You're the offensive coordinator. Mike Zimmer gets fired. So that's not, you can say like, well, if the offense was better, maybe the coach would have kept his job. But at the same time, it's like, I would look at that differently if Klint got fired and Mike Zimmer kept his job, right? Like if Klint beat Carmichael in this Saints scenario where you fired the OC and you're like, we have a problem here, we're going to fix it. That's not what happened there. He goes out to Denver as the quarterback's coach for Russell Wilson, right? He's also the passing game coordinator. That Nathaniel Hackett tenure goes terribly. Yeah. He actually took over play calling duties at some point in that season. It's tough to know exactly when. So he was in charge of that offense, and the offense did look better as the season went on. So we should get a little credit for that. But it is weird. You don't typically see your quarterback's coach / passing game coordinator calling plays and the offensive coordinator not calling plays. So that was kind of a weird one. Obviously, that whole staff gets fired. He's part of that. Sean Payton goes in. Sean Payton wasn't going to retain Klint Kubiak. So he goes out to San Francisco. Now, things didn't go poorly there. In fact, they went very well. He's the passing game coordinator, passing game specialist, whatever. So then he gets plucked away. So it is an interesting scenario where you're talking about a guy who's going to be on his 4th team in 4 seasons, but you can look at it and say he wasn't fired from any of those jobs. He was just in the culling of 2 entire staffs and then got plucked out of a 3rd staff. And what I will say positively for him is he was in Minnesota for 2 seasons prior to becoming the offensive coordinator. So he did stick there, and he was brought back to the Vikings after serving as offensive quality control coach in 2013, 2014. So a majority of his coaching career to this point was with the Vikings. So I do feel a little better about it, knowing that's like, okay, yeah, he was an integral part of Mike Zimmer's staff for multiple seasons. It's not like he's the reason that all of these staffs are falling apart.
Yeah, when you look at it, I guess you could say he does have play calling experience, but obviously it's not that grandioso. But I don't think the Saints had any real candidates, or out of the 11 or 12 that had a ton of play calling experience that they interviewed.
I mean, no, you had a few. Luke Getsy was one of the candidates. He was the offensive coordinator for the Bears the last 2 seasons. Well, I mean, it's just same play calling experience.
No, I hear you, right.
I mean, he like Klint Kubiak calling plays for the Broncos in 2022 wasn't exactly a dream come true, right? So, but we're talking about experience as experience. Now, Mike Sullivan was also a play caller previously. He called plays for the Giants, and then he called plays for the Steelers this past season after Matt Canada got fired. So he was another one. There was at least one more that had some play calling experience. But yeah, you ended up going with Klint Kubiak, and I feel good about it. Klint he's just an interesting guy. He's 36 years old, so he's younger, which is, I think, a good thing. I think if you're trying to rebuild your offense, you're trying to modernize things, I do want to go with somebody younger, right? Like he's not younger than Derek Carr, which is, I think, helpful. He is his senior by a few years. But he's a young guy that's also been in the league for a while. He's got 10 years of coaching experience in the NFL. He also spent time as the wide receivers coach at Kansas for a season, so this is a guy who's been around the game. He's been on coaching staffs
forever. Plus his dad, like you mentioned earlier.
And it's a football family, right? So he's green in that sense. And I think that's a good thing. So you were able to kind of thread that needle of getting a young guy in the room that also has a lot of coaching experience and has been on several different staffs. I think be going around the block on the NFL and just kind of getting the idea of how all of these teams operate and being able to kind of pluck what works and erase what didn't work. And I think that learning experience is valuable. So I feel good about that. One of the interesting things for Klint, and this is not unique to him, but it is, I don't want to say rare, but it's, typically when you get into coaching on the side of the ball that you played. DA actually, he did spend some time on the offensive side of the ball, but he was a safety at Texas A&M, and he ended up going back and coaching the secondary, coaching the defense, becoming a defensive coordinator. Now he's a head coach. Klint also played safety in college at Colorado State. Klint thought he was going to be, his goal was to play professionally. It didn't really work out for him, and he got into coaching. He went back to Texas A&M, where he's from Houston, and got into the coaching ranks and kind of worked his way up, but immediately went to the offensive side of the ball. And I'm interested to ask him whenever we inevitably talk to Klint for the first time, how that happened, because it is interesting, right? Like you play defense and then you start, coaching wide receivers. And I do feel like that's a unique perspective. And I almost wonder if that helped him kind of get on the right side of things with Dennis Allen, because they both played safety. So they kind of speak the same language in that way. But I do like the idea of having your offensive coordinator coming up on the defensive side of the ball and knowing both sides, because I think that's part of it. Is like you can call a perfect play, but you also have to understand what the defense is doing. And you have to be able to lead your quarterback in understanding what the defense is doing. And I'm hopeful that he'll be able to do that.
What's also interesting with the whole thing, obviously, Dennis Allen went to Texas A&M. Kubiak started his coaching career over at Texas A&M. Like you mentioned, he didn't go to college there, but he did start his coaching career there. So there's a little bit of that Aggie connection.
Yeah, and Gary was a wide receiver or running backs coach at A&M when Dennis Allen was a player. So it all kind of links. I am curious to hear whether, DA met Klint when he was, 4 or 5 years old, because that was like 1992. So he would have been, I don't know, 4 or 5 at that point. But yeah, so it's like, I knew you when you were a baby.
I'm wondering too, is Klint going to bring Clay Kubiak with him from the 49ers?
That's a good question. There's also Klint Kubiak, who is an area scout for the Cowboys. So we you know, it's funny because Darren and David Carr have the same kind of naming convention of going with the same letter for all 3 kids. And now they're kind of, there's this connection, and they can debate who made announcers more frustrated throughout their careers. It's almost as bad as that time I saw Alan Ray trying to defend Ray Allen in an NBA game, and that must have been a nightmare to call. But no, so we're going back to the Vikings a little bit. One thing about Klint Kubiak, he's an opening statement guy. I don't know if anyone cares. Okay, I care because he's the type of you know what I mean. You don't understand what I'm saying?
Right, doesn't just walk up to the mic. Okay, go ahead, fire ahead.
Yeah, well, so like Pete Carmichael and Joe Woods throughout this season, it would always be like, all right, go fire away is the one they would say. And it was always ironic because I was like, that's probably what's going to happen, Pete, but that's fine. We're going to talk about that down the road. But yeah, Klint is the type of guy who will walk up and he'll be like, oh, we're a great week of practice, blah, blah, blah. It's kind of a head coach vibe, right? Like I very much can see Klint being a head coach at some point. Now, I'm not saying that he's going to take over for DA. Don't take my comments and be like, oh, it's only a matter of time. But I do think that, if things go well in New Orleans, he will end up on a short list like Dave Canales to go somewhere and be a head coach. So just take that for what it is. But, you go back and you look at, and so the Vikings, that was his first time calling plays. And it was interesting. I went back and watched a bunch of Klint Kubiak interviews, and things went well to start. They really fell off at the end of the 2021 season. And I think that played a pretty big role in how you end up getting fired. It's funny because that season went very similarly to how the Saints season went this year. They were 5-7. They won a game. They won a couple games to get to 7-7. Then they lost to the Rams in week 16. That actually happened in 2021 to the Vikings. They lost to the Rams in week 16, just like the Saints did this year. So they were 5-7. They won 2 games to get to 7-7. And then they lost to the Rams to go to 7-8. And then that was the year the Rams won the Super Bowl. So it was a very good Rams team that year, obviously. Then the next week, and it's funny because, like, okay, how does a head coach get fired in that scenario? The Vikings went 8-9 that season. It wasn't a nightmare season. But how did they get there? Well, in week 17, they go face the Packers and get blown out. Sean Mannion was the quarterback. I think Kirk Cousins got hurt. And so you give him a little credit there. But, like, that's how, this season, if that had gone that way, if the Saints had gone out to Tampa and got blown out like 36-17 or whatever the score would have been, I think DA gets fired. I think that's the trigger, right? Like you could see a very easy scenario where if the season ended the way the Vikings did, which is get blown out by a division rival in week 17, then go beat a division rival in week 18 after you're already eliminated from the postseason. That's a very different feeling than what the Saints did, which was go out in a game they had to win to have a chance, beat that division rival, and then come home and beat the Falcons. And that's how you end up here. But it was the opposite for the Vikings. And that's what happened. But, I do think that by that point in the season, maybe some people had figured you out. Maybe there were some issues that cropped up, and he talked about in earlier in the season, because he kept getting asked about, okay, it's your first season as the play caller. What are kind of your takeaways? What have you learned? And one of the things he talked about was one of the difficulties in becoming a very good play caller is you can't just be thinking of the play, the next play, the next play. You have to be thinking 2-3 plays ahead. And Mark Schlereth actually talked about this when he was evaluating the Saints-Texans game because he called that game. And one of his criticisms of the Saints offense was it very much felt like it's just somebody calling a play. And then it's like, well, that didn't work. So what's the next play? What's the next play? And there's a difference between doing that and calling an offense, which is, you have an idea of what you're doing. You have plays, you have counters, you have a shot play you're trying to get to. So how do I set that up? How can I break the tendencies that I've already created in this game? Or how can I break the tendencies that I created last game? Like Kyle Shanahan, one of the things he does as well as anybody is he creates tendencies with the goal of breaking them, right? Like he creates his own tendency so that he can break it once he sees teams reacting to it. And that's the difference between calling plays and calling an offense. And here's talking prior to that Week 18 game, which is, dead man walking, right? Like that coaching staff was about to get fired into the sun, that Mike Zimmer coaching staff. And I thought his answer to this question, which is kind of, looking back on the season as it was, reflecting, and, what are some of your biggest takeaways?
One game left. When you look back on your first full year at the Reins, your dad can tell you so much, you can observe so much, but in it learning, what is maybe the number one lesson that you're like, oh, that's what everyone has told me about, but now I understand it from a different perspective. I'm living through it.
I really wish I could give you one thing. I wish I could do that, but I can't. It's been plenty of things. The thing that just sticks out in my mind every day is that it's never a one-man operation. It's a team thing. It's the whole offensive staff working together, and I don't know how anyone would do it without a great staff like us. I'm really blessed to work with veteran guys that we care about each other and we work hard for each other. And on game day and throughout the week, there's a lot of communication, and I've leaned on their experience all year. And there's been so much positive things that have happened in games that people have given me credit for that don't belong to me. They belong to Kennedy Palomao and Phil Rauscher and Keenan and Andrew and Coach Zimmer. And there's been plenty of negative things that do belong to me. So I think it's all about having a cohesive unit, cohesive staff, and I think when you have that, you can have a lot of success. Yeah,
and I think what I need to see from Klint, we're going to talk about this in the next segment a little bit, is what he's saying there to be true, which is, it can't just be a one-man operation on the offensive staff. You got to be able to take input, feedback, and work from it. One thing that I thought was interesting is, the Vikings were 32nd in the NFL in RPO passes in 2021. Now you have Kirk Cousins, right? Of course, you're not going to be running a ton of RPO, but they were last. They were dead last. And I did think that was interesting because the Kyle Shanahan scheme, while it's still not going to be heavy in RPOs, it is low. It's down toward the bottom. I think this past season, they were 27th in RPO passes, 28th in RPO runs. Where I was surprised to see was the Vikings were 22nd in play action attempts, but they were 13th in yards in play action attempts. That says to me is like, you're not getting to the play action all that often, but you are hitting on it. And I do wonder, you look at it and you say, okay, well, why aren't you running play action more? If it's this successful element of your offense, why aren't you doing it more? And I just think that's, a first year play caller, there's a lot of things that it's going to get away from you, right? There's going to be points where it gets away from you. And how do you learn from that and move forward? And we haven't really gotten to see that as much as you probably would have liked, because he wasn't really a full-time play caller again since being with the Vikings. But, this year the 49ers were 17th in play action. The Vikings under Kevin O'Connell were number 1, which is kind of interesting. Wow. And that's going to be a major theme of the Saints offense is how do you adjust? How do you get to the play action more? How do you run more misdirection plays? How do you get ahead of yourself without getting ahead of yourself? And I think one of the major themes of this season is going to be how much has Klint learned since what I would say was largely unsuccessful first time as an offensive coordinator. And if that answer is quite a bit, then I think he can have a lot of success here.
Yeah, the one thing that concerns me, obviously, folks, I feel a lot of fans or maybe even some analysts are just trying to plug in now, what's Klint Kubiak going to do with the Saints? And it's like, all right, Alvin Kamara can be the McCaffrey, and, Ayuk could be Chris Olave, and the Saints need to get a George Kittle. I'm not really sure it works like that.
No, I mean, that's why I think it's going to be interesting. And I was on with Tommy Tucker this morning, and he asked, well, what's the Saints offense going to look like? And I'm going to be honest, I don't know right now. Because I think everyone's assuming that it's going to be a 49ers clone. And I don't know why that would, I think there's elements of that 49ers offense that you're going to bring over if you're Klint.
Yeah.
But he spent 1 year there. Right. And so I think you're going to have to, it's going to be an amalgamation of the things that were good from all of his offenses. Right. One of the play designs that I thought was really interesting as I went back and watched some of the Vikings clips is they would actually shift Justin Jefferson into the backfield and have him run like a Texas route, almost like an angle route out of the backfield. And it's like the design wasn't even necessarily to get Justin Jefferson the ball. The design was to open up routes for other people. And, that's not a 49ers thing. He wasn't on the 49ers at that point. So, and, if there's going to be Gary Kubiak elements of his offense, there's going to be, I don't know how much the Broncos scheme you're going to incorporate. But I do think it's an oversimplification to look at it and say, well, the 49ers did this and it worked. So that's just going to be what it looks like. Now, I do think you're going to see a lot of things that look similar to the 49ers. You're going to see a lot of condensed formations. You're going to see a lot of wide zones. I do think that Taysom can be used in a role similar to Kyle Juszczyk. Not necessarily to say he's a fullback, but I think you're going to end up seeing Taysom Hill motioned into the backfield a lot more, or starting in the backfield and motioning out of the backfield. Because I just think he creates matchup issues when you do that in ways that no other player on this team probably can, other than maybe an Alvin Kamara, but he's obviously going to be in the backfield the majority of the time anyway. But no, I just think it's funny because we're going to be out there in training camp kind of watching this develop and watching some of the things they're working on, and it's going to look a lot different. And we're going to learn at that point, what are some of the fundamental things they're going to add in this offense. It's like, I don't think anyone has an answer right now.
Yeah,
that's why I'm looking forward to talking to Clint. And
like you said, there's going to be obviously some elements, but you can't just assume that the 49ers offense is just going to be replicated here.
And it shouldn't be like that. That's what I don't want to see, is that, like, I want to see a guy who understands why the 49ers do what they do. Yeah. And who can kind of innovate on that, right? One of the things about the 49ers offense that most people don't talk about is, like, there's no such thing as a Kyle Shanahan scheme. There's a guy who understands how to be at the cutting edge of NFL offense and builds on it and builds on it and builds on it. The 2023 Kyle Shanahan scheme doesn't really look that much like the 2021 Kyle Shanahan scheme. Both worked, but he keeps building on it. And that's what I need to see from Clint. Is not a guy who's gonna just say, well, this is what my dad did in this situation, that's what I'm gonna do. This is what Kyle did in this situation, that's what I'm gonna do. I need to see someone who understands why they do those things and continues to build on that. Because if you are not someone who can do that, eventually people are going to catch up with you, and your stint's not going to last very long.
Totally agree there. Yeah, I'm interested, obviously, Sue, to see what exactly we're in for come training camp. And even that's going to be, it's not going to be an exact science of what was going to happen week one for this black and gold club, but at least you get a sense of what's going to be different for this coming season. I know even player wise, I've given up trying to forecast what's going to happen in a regular season come training camp, a la like a Jawan Johnson we thought was going to dominate this past season.
Yeah, that was frustrating. But all right, let's end this segment here. We're going to come back. We're going to keep talking about Klint Kubiak, but I have to let you listen to some ads first. That's what everyone waits all this time
for sure.
To hear. Yeah, and the products and services that bring you this podcast.
Ice Spice, we go.
Yes. Dunkin' Donuts might get in there. Who knows? We got plenty. But all right, this is Inside Black and Gold. I'm Jeff Nowak. He is Steve Geller. We're going to come back. We're going to talk more about Klint Kubiak. I looked up some first 15 numbers because I think that was an issue for the Saints this year. And I do think when you look at Clint, what he's done, his success rate in the scheduled part, what's the word? I'm not the planned part of the offense is much better than what we saw from Pete Carmichael these past 2 years. So stick around. We're going to get into it right on the other side of these ads. And we're back here on Inside Black and Gold. I'm Jeff Nowak. He is Steve Geller. One of the reasons I wanted to plug all the Klint Kubiak stuff at the back end of the pod was that, maybe we're going to get an announcement from the Saints about, these moves are made official before we end the podcast. So we don't have to be like, well, come back next time for the accurate version of this has all been done. It doesn't seem like we have. So if you're listening to this and you're like, well, why aren't they talking about this if it's already been announced? That's why.
No, the only thing I've seen so far is plenty of the Kansas City Chiefs celebration, and it just makes me sad because of how long it's been for the black and gold, obviously.
Yeah. Well, it is funny because it's like everyone wants to be Super Bowl or bust, right? But
they're spoiled now, right?
it can't always be that. And I've always felt like the most fun part of it for the teams that aren't the dynasty, which, you know, is the 0.001% of NFL fan bases, right? Like, yeah, great. You got Tom Brady, you got Pat Mahomes. That can't be your plan. The Patriots didn't plan on getting Tom Brady. The Patriots lucked into Tom Brady. The Chiefs planned on getting Pat Mahomes, but I don't think they weren't. I don't think at the time they were like, this is going to be a legendary quarterback who wins 4 Super Bowls in 5 years or whatever. Like, that's so much of it is luck. And I heard some people, I saw at least one take that was like, you just got to keep tanking until you find your legendary quarterback. And it was like, the teams that ended up with the legendary quarterbacks didn't tank to get them. The Patriots,
right? They weren't usually picking one overall.
Right. Well, that's just like the Patriots didn't tank to get Tom Brady. They had Drew Bledsoe, and they were like, yeah, we're going to win with Drew. And then they eventually went to Tom, and it was like, okay, this is the guy. The Chiefs had Alex Smith, right? Like they had a plan. They were trying to win. You know, it's like, sure, if you're the Bengals and you're bad for so long and you end up with the number 1 pick and you get Joe Burrow, it's like, great. You know, Andrew Luck's a good example of that too. But like, that wasn't like, they didn't go into that season. The Colts is a bad example, but like the Bengals didn't go into that season trying to lose. They just went into that season really bad. Like, they were just a bad team. They didn't set that up. That's just what happened. And I do think it's funny, but I don't know. Like, I at a certain point as a fan base, you need to just appreciate the process. And I feel like it's been so long for the Saints that you have to be able to appreciate, like, everyone's like, oh, they're going to get to the playoffs and lose. But like, that's a part of the process, is getting to the playoffs, right? So you shouldn't be disappointed in a season that gets to the playoffs. You can't look at this all as an extension of the Drew Brees, Sean Payton era, because that era is gone. You need to find a winning recipe in the now era.
Sure.
And that's what I miss. Like the Bills showed up to play the Saints on Thanksgiving in 2021. And that was kind of the beginning of the Bills figuring out, like, oh crap, we can win a Super Bowl with this team. And, you know, it's kind of like the Lions this year showing up at the Dome, and like, they're all so excited to watch a winning team, you know? Mm-hmm. And I think we're getting to that point where Saints fans are going to start appreciating that again, the way they did probably back in 2006, where it was like, you know, all your expectations were real low and they were exceeded, you know?
It's tough. I get it. You get that taste of the one Lombardi and now you're spiraled and you want another one. And we've been talking to that forever and it just hasn't happened.
Yeah. No, and I mean, it's frustrating when you kind of get to that point where it's like, you do have to kind of reset the deck a little bit. And that's what happens when you have to move on from a Hall of Fame quarterback, which is just something that happens when you have a Hall of Fame quarterback. At some point, the Chiefs are going to have to move on from Pat Mahomes. And I guarantee you that's not going to be a pleasant process. The Patriots had to move on from Tom Brady. Do you think that's been a pleasant process?
No, shoot, Bill Belichick's gone, for crying out loud.
Yeah. The Saints had to move on from Drew Brees, and it has gone, you know, realistically speaking, you're talking about a team that has gone 500 in the 3 seasons after losing Drew Brees.
Yeah.
Like, it could have been worse. That's all I'm going to say. The frustrating thing is those 2 winning seasons were 9-8 and didn't get to the postseason.
Right.
But it is funny. It's like, you hear people talk about this season like it's been like these last 3 seasons, like they've been an abject disaster. And the only way you would consider it that is if like your idea was, oh, we're going to tank and get to the top of the draft and draft a quarterback, and hopefully that quarterback will be the next Tom Brady, but next Drew Brees. But yeah,
I gotta say, Jeff, even though, you know, it looked disjointed and, you know, unimaginative, this Saints offense still performed pretty well when you look at the stats and points per game. I think they were in the top, 15 at least, right? And points per game in the NFL, which I did not expect from this squad at all.
You know, that's a good segue into what I want to talk about. So Klint Kubiak and Pete Carmichael, and one area that I think they differed dramatically is, and this is something that, as I was listening back to some of these interviews that Klint did as the offensive coordinator of the Vikings, one of the themes that got brought up a lot was this team is very good in the scripted portion of the game, right? The first 15 or however many scripted plays there are, they're very effective, to the point that there was talks about, hey, we want to have a scripted portion coming out of halftime because they were so good in that part of the game that it was like, how do we replicate this as the game goes on? And it was kind of the opposite of what the Saints had this year, which is you were so bad early in games, but you were able to make some adjustments and to find some things that worked later in the game. And that's where a lot of those points, particularly early in the season, points, yards, second half when you were down, like you went into halftime trailing by 10 points and had to make a rally. The game against the Lions, game against the Jaguars, game against the Texans are good examples of that. And so I went through and I just wanted to, because like you'll see opening drive results. We know that the Saints only scored one touchdown on an opening drive all season, but it's about more than that. It's about, okay, how about the rest of the scripted portion? Because it's not like you only go with the script for the first drive. If you only get 6 plays done, you're going to come back and you're going to run the rest of that script on the next drive. So I went through and I looked at, okay, how did the Vikings fare on those first 15 plus? Like, so if you started a drive on your 13th play of the game and it finished with a touchdown, I counted that. Whereas sometimes it's like, okay, you got through 14 plays in your first 2 drives. I'm not necessarily giving the script credit for the next drive.
Right.
But so you look at it and you say, okay, it's kind of a weird metric because the Vikings in the first 15 in 2021, they had 46 drives, but more drives is not necessarily a good thing, because that means that maybe you had a ton of 3 and outs. And so you got more drives out of those first 15 plays, or, but the flip side is, hey, maybe you scored in 2 plays. And so you got more drives. And it's interesting. So they're very similar numbers with one major difference. So the Saints had 41 drives. They had 3 missed field goals in their first 15 of this past season. Back-to-back games, the Saints got the ball on their opening offensive drive, drove down the field for a 50-something yard field goal, and Blake Grupe missed. Another game, their opening drive, this was against the Panthers. They drove down and missed a short field goal. So 3 opening drives this season ended in a missed field goal for the Saints. So that's kind of hurting their numbers here, because you can see, okay, so they had 5 made field goals on opening drives. The Vikings in 2021 had 9. So that would have been, had you not missed those field goals, which the Vikings only had 1, those numbers would be a lot closer. 3 turnovers for the Saints. I'm sorry, 5 turnovers for the Saints. I included turnovers on downs. 3 for the Vikings in 2021. 20 punts for the Vikings, 20 punts for the Saints. But the biggest difference is the Vikings scored 13 touchdowns on drives that happened in the first 15 plays of the game, so the scripted portion. The Saints had 8. Now, it might not sound like a crazy amount, but if the Saints had scored 5 more touchdowns this season, they're probably a 10-win team. Like that's the difference between going 10-7 or maybe 11-6 and winning some of these close games, and going 9-8 and losing all of these close games. The other thing that I'll note is in that season, the Vikings, they had 9 games where they scored multiple times in their first 15, like scripted part of their offense. So not only did they score once, they got the ball back and scored again in that scripted portion. The Saints did that 0 times. These numbers for the Vikings also look a little worse than they are, because the portion of the season where you sealed your fate of getting fired was so weeks 17 and 18, the Vikings did not score once in their first 15, and they punted. They had 7 possessions, 6 punts, and 1 turnover on downs. So this was week 17 and 18. Now keep in mind, Sean Mannion was playing quarterback. There was some headwinds they were flying into, but like if when you think about it, they had 13 touchdowns over the first 15 weeks of the season. So like that means you are scoring a touchdown in your opening script almost an average of 1 time per game. So, I mean, that's pretty good, right? And if the Saints were able to do that more effectively, more efficiently this season, they win a lot more games. So that's one thing I'm encouraged by as you look at Klint, is he is an expert at creating that plan, that opening plan to get the game started on the right foot. And when you are a team led by a strong defense, getting out to a hot start will mean a lot more wins. So, I have questions about how he adjusts as the game goes on. And I think that was an issue for him with the Vikings is, like we talked about, he wasn't always thinking enough plays ahead. So like being good at scripting the offense doesn't mean this isn't the same thing as being good at adjusting on the fly with the offense. But that's kind of where I'd like to see him improve. But I do think that he's kind of a wizard in that way of being able to script things effectively. That's all.
Well, I like that, because wave that wand, because we've saw plenty of times this season where things just started out so slow and didn't really come around till after the half, honestly. Sometimes second quarter, but after halftime, like all of a sudden the offense would wake up and it felt a little like too little, too late kind of thing. And
a lot of times you're playing from behind. And when the games that the Saints played from ahead this past season, they won a lot of those games. You can't look at this past season and say, like the 49ers in the Super Bowl, right? They had a 10-point lead in the first quarter. They blew it. That's Kyle Shanahan's calling card, is having big leads in the Super Bowl and his team blowing them. One or two as head coach, one as the offensive coordinator for the Falcons in that great 28-3 game that we like to talk about so often. Here's one thing. In the Super Bowl, they muffed a punt. The 49ers muffed a punt, and it was like the turning point in that game. You know that the two players involved, one of them hit off his foot, and the other one tried to pick it up and didn't. The player who the ball hit off his foot was number 28, and the player who tried to pick it up and failed was Ray McLeod, number 3.
Still
can't make that stuff up.
Yeah, no, you can't. Still just haunts Shanahan.
Yeah. But like you look at the Saints season, and there's a lot of things they did wrong, and there's a lot of ways that it didn't go well, but you can't, other than that Packers game, which has had a lot more to do with Derek Carr going out with an injury than necessarily blowing a lead, you can't really look at a lot of games where it was like they got ahead and they blew the lead.
No, right.
It was always, okay, they got behind in the first half, they made a rally, and they couldn't get over the top. So, one of the ways that you can fix that is by scoring earlier in the game and having success in ways that and I think that when you're talking about an offensive coordinator being creative and understanding how to attack a certain defense, being able to create that plan, that script, that there's a lot to be said for that. And I do think that was one of the things that Pete struggled with the most this past season. And when things were on the fly, when it was kind of just, everything's going around and you're calling plays and you're adjusting, I think he was good at that, but he wasn't good at creating that kind of creative plan early in games. And so we'll see. The other thing is, the quarterback's coach, Andrew Janocko, is that's the guy who's supposed to be the quarterback's coach for the Saints. They worked together in Minnesota. Clancy Barone was a guy that Klint Kubiak worked with in Denver previously. And then John Benton, I think they have crossed paths, but I can't recall. He's going to be the offensive line coach. It's been reported pretty widely. So those are all guys that I'm interested to hear from.
Yeah, you were kind of joking about we were waiting to hear, during the podcast, the Saints come out with this formal announcement. Well, we're not the Chargers podcast, so we don't have to go back and backtrack. They've sent out their whole list of coaching staff hires for already. So eventually the Saints will do the same, and we'll have to catch up.
Yeah, and so just before we go, there's one other clip from Klint. This is prior to the 2021 season with the Vikings. And one thing that I can say is, I do not miss Zoom interviews. These are both Zoom interviews, so he's wearing headphones and talking to a computer. I just think you don't get very good answers to questions when you're in that format. But this was a really interesting question, and I didn't expect him as I heard the question being asked, I did not expect him to answer it in a way that actually addressed the question, but he did. And I was just like, oh, okay. And it gives me hope that we'll have some coordinator interviews this year with some actual content in them. Because he's asked here kind of, do you want to be insulated as the play caller? Something of that extent. So let's listen to it.
Klint, you've obviously worked with your dad for a long time, and I'm wondering, how insulated do you feel just with the pieces that are around you on the coaching staff? I know Rick Dennison has been part of the Kubiak offense for a while. He's called run plays. He's called plays before. How insulated do you feel you'll be as you try this out for the first time, and how insulated do you want to be?
I think it is a true blessing to be with Rick and Brian and all the coaches that are coming back. And the more continuity that we have as a staff, certainly the better communicators we can be to our players. To answer your question best is I'm certainly always looking for ways to be uncomfortable. And when I feel insulated, I feel confident in the experience and the continuity that I have around me. But I want those guys to challenge me every day. I want KP, Keenan, Rick, Brian, Andrew, I want those guys to challenge me. I want to challenge them so we can get the best out of each other, because certainly we're not going to go anywhere standing still and resting on our laurels from years past.
Yeah, and I think that's important. And as you build out this staff, and like I said several times, we don't know exactly who the staff is at the time we're recording this podcast. I expect to hear a few more names pretty quickly throughout the week. That staff needs to, you can't be yes men, right? Like that's why this process is very important, because it can't just be guys like, yeah, Klint, you're the man, let's do this. It's got to be guys.
Yeah, you're great point. Yeah,
you see something wrong and you fix it. And one of the things that I think is going to be really interesting to see how it develops is, I don't know if I mentioned this previously, obviously, but Klint Kubiak, before he took over as the offense coordinator with the Vikings, had spent 2 years as the quarterbacks coach. He knew Kirk Cousins like as well as you can in that role before taking over as the offensive coordinator. That's not the case this year. He's coming in blind, maybe not blind, but he's coming in relatively blind in terms of working with Derek Carr. See, that's going to have to happen fast. It's going to have to happen fast, and you're not going to have the luxury of saying, well, this worked last year. This worked the year before. This is how he likes to, have the offense display it to him. This is how he likes to go through his reads. This is how he likes to kind of absorb these notes. You're going to have to learn that in real time. And that's, so it's going to have to be a group effort. And so a guy like Andrew Janocko, who he referenced in that interview, he talked to, he's like, when he said Andrew, that's who he was talking about, was Andrew Janocko, the quarterback's coach. It's going to be a process. So I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a fun off season as we kind of develop this, and we'll have more episodes in the coming days, kind of leaning into some of these hires when they're made. But I think that's, I don't know, hopefully I gave you a decent picture of Klint as offensive coordinator.
And definitely hoping things go smoothly, because I'm just waiting for, right off the bat hearing, well, Derek Carr and the rest of the offense are learning a new system, blah, blah, blah. Nobody wants to hear that heading into this season.
No, and I do think, I talked to Tommy Tucker on the air this morning about this. And if I'm looking for reasons that, last year you were like, well, okay, learning a new system, that took a little while. It wasn't as finely tuned of a machine as you wanted it to be early in the season. There was also the process of learning the playmakers and learning how your teammates like to do certain things and learning how they like to run certain routes. Juwan Johnson, I think, is a good example of that. I think throughout the season, there were kind of fits and starts where, okay, this isn't the way that I'm used to it. This is how you run it and this whole thing. So I think, I don't know if as important as learning the system and being comfortable in the system, being comfortable with your playmakers and being comfortable with how they operate and how they run routes and how they communicate with like a Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, Kendre Miller, Alvin Kamara, Juwan Johnson. I think that's being a step forward in that process is going to help Klint and the new staff install. And that's my hopeful take. But yeah, it's going to be very, very frustrating if we get to week 6 and we're like, oh, he's just learning. He's still learning. No, can't be that.
No, and Dennis Allen definitely doesn't want that either, because I think, obviously going into this season, he's going to be one of those coaches talked about on the hot seat for 2024.
As he should be, because he is, for good reason. But all right, that's going to wrap up this episode of Inside Black and Gold, the first episode of the season 3. We'll be having plenty more. I'd like to get an updated mock draft at you soon, so that'll be something we can get into maybe next week.
Where's the champagne?
It's too early for champagne. It's post Mardi Gras. I don't need alcohol. And
we're trying to detox.
Need to go for a jog. That's what I need. Let's have a celebratory season 3 jogging session to Soft J. But all right. Thanks everyone for listening. Who dat? Go Saints.
Playoffs are bust this year, Jeff, for the pod.
That's what we said last year. It worked. No, it didn't. All right, y'all. Be easy. Peace.
Later.